Ree was one man who knew exactly what was killing Elvis Presley. Not a rumor, not a theory, not a guess whispered between journalists or debated on talk shows. He knew. He had the files. He had the prescriptions. He had sat across from Elvis in a medical office and looked him in the eye, and he had a choice to make. And for years, too many years, he made the wrong one. His name was Dr. George Nicopolis, and the secret he carried could have saved Elvis Presley's life. This is the story he spent decades trying to bury, and the truth that finally refused to stay quiet. By the early 1970s, Elvis Presley was not well. Anyone with eyes could see it, or should have. The man who had once moved like water on a stage, loose and electric and impossibly alive, was now moving like someone carrying invisible weight. His face, which had once been almost unreasonably handsome, had grown swollen and pale. His eyes, which used to burn with something close to mischief, had gone flat, distant, like the lights in a room being turned down one by one. But nobody said anything. Not really. Not in a way that changed anything. To understand why, you have to understand what Elvis had become by that point. Not just to the public, but to the people around him. He wasn't just a famous man. He was an industry. He was the financial engine that kept dozens of people employed, that paid the mortgages and the salaries and the entire enormous machinery of Graceland and the touring operation and the management apparatus that had grown up around him like a second skeleton. When that much money and that many livelihoods are attached to one man's ability to keep performing, the people closest to him develop a very convenient kind of blindness. Elvis was in pain, real physical chronic pain. His back had deteriorated badly. Years of performing, of dropping to his knees and twisting and throwing himself around stages, had taken a brutal toll on his spine. He had glaucoma. He had an enlarged heart. He had a condition called megacolon, a painful intestinal disorder that caused him suffering that most people would have found completely debilitating. He was sick. He had been sick for a long time, and into that sickness walked a doctor who would change everything, though not in the way anyone had hoped. Dr. George Nicopolis, known to Elvis simply as Dr. Nick, first came into Elvis's life in 1967. He was a Memphis physician, well regarded, personable, the kind of doctor who made patients feel genuinely cared for. And in the beginning, he was exactly what Elvis needed: someone medically competent, someone who took his pain seriously. Elvis responded to him the way Elvis always responded to people who made him feel safe. He pulled him close. He made him part of the inner circle. Dr. Nick traveled with Elvis on tour. He was there at Graceland. He was present at concerts, backstage, on the road. A constant, reassuring presence for a man whose health was becoming an increasingly complicated situation. And that closeness, as it turned out, was the problem. Because there is a line that exists in medicine, a clear, firm, essential line between being a patient's doctor and being their friend, between clinical judgment and personal loyalty, between what the medicine says and what the patient wants to hear. Dr. Nick, over the years, allowed that line to blur, then to disappear, then to become something he couldn't even remember having drawn. Elvis didn't want to be told no. No great shock there. He was a man who had not been told no in a meaningful way since 1955. The people around him had learned, through trial and error and the very natural human desire not to upset someone powerful, that disagreement came with consequences. Not violent consequences. Elvis wasn't a cruel man. But the atmosphere around him had a gravity to it. You either orbited his world on his terms, or you drifted away. Dr. Nick chose to stay, and staying meant prescribing. After Elvis died, investigators began looking at the medical records. What they found was staggering. In the final months of Elvis Presley's life, Dr. George Nicopolis had prescribed him more than 10,000 doses of various medications, sedatives, amphetamines, painkillers, barbiturates, anti-anxiety drugs. In the last 8 months alone, the 8 months leading up to August 16th, 1977, Dr. Nick had written prescriptions for Elvis totaling quantities that, when laid out on paper, looked less like medical care and more like a pharmaceutical avalanche. A state investigation followed, then a medical board hearing, then a criminal trial. Dr. Nick was charged with over 100 counts of illegally prescribing drugs, not just to Elvis, to other patients as well. The case against him was built on records that told a story with brutal clarity. Here was a man with a medical license, writing prescriptions at a volume that no legitimate clinical need could justify. He was acquitted of the criminal charges. The jury deliberated and came back not guilty. But the medical board saw it differently. His license was eventually suspended, revoked. The career he had built over decades was dismantled by the very records he had kept. And through all of it, the trial, the hearings, the public scrutiny, Dr. Nick maintained the same position. He had been trying to help. He had been managing Elvis's pain. He had been attempting to control the situation by keeping the prescriptions within his oversight rather than letting Elvis find them elsewhere. It was, depending on how charitable you're willing to be, either a terrible miscalculation or something harder to forgive. But here's the thing about that defense that doesn't get examined nearly enough. It might have been true, partially, and that partial truth is what makes this story genuinely tragic rather than simply outrageous. Dr. Nicopolis was not the only doctor prescribing to Elvis. That is a fact that gets buried in the easier, cleaner narrative of one villainous physician. The truth was messier. Elvis had learned, over the years, how to work the medical system the way he worked everything else in his life. With charm, with persistence, and with enough money and fame to make people want to say yes to him. He saw multiple physicians. He had prescriptions filled under assumed names. When one doctor hesitated, he found another. The Memphis Mafia, his loyal inner circle, sometimes assisted in obtaining medications when the official channels slowed down. Dr. Nick knew some of this, possibly all of it, and his reasoning, whatever you think of it morally, had a dark internal logic. If Elvis was going to get the drugs one way or another, better to have them come through a doctor who could monitor dosages than through whatever back channel a desperate man might find at 2 a.m. in Memphis. That logic, stretched out over 10 years, produced the prescription records that investigators found after Elvis died. But the deeper truth, the one that sits uncomfortably beneath all the legal language and the medical board findings, is that Elvis Presley existed inside a system that was never designed to protect him. The music industry that needed him to keep touring, the management that needed him to keep earning, the entourage that needed him to stay the center of their universe, the fans who needed him to be the king, the doctors who needed him to be manageable. Not one single mechanism in that entire system was built to prioritize the actual human being inside the jumpsuits. And Dr. Nick, for all his failures, and they were real, serious, consequential failures, was one part of a machine that had been grinding Elvis down since 1955. He became the face of the blame because someone had to be the face. Because it was easier to point at one doctor than to reckon with an entire industry, an entire culture, an entire country's worth of appetite for a man who had nothing left to give. In his later years, Dr. Nick gave interviews, sporadic, careful, but revealing in the spaces between the words. He talked about Elvis on the road in 1977, the final tour. He described flying on the plane with him, watching him prepare to go on stage in cities across America, knowing what the audiences didn't know, that this man was struggling to stand upright, that there were nights when Dr. Nick stood in the wings and genuinely did not know if Elvis was going to make it through the set. He talked about trying to intervene, about conversations that went nowhere, about a man who did not want to be saved because being saved would have meant stopping. And stopping for Elvis was something he truly did not know how to do. The performing was the only place left where he still felt like himself, or some version of himself, the version the world recognized. In one interview, Dr. Nick said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. He said that Elvis was the most medicated performer he had ever seen, and also the most determined. That those two things existed simultaneously, side by side, in the same man, on the same stage, every single night. He said he would think about that for the rest of his life. You believe him. On August 15th, 1977, the night before Elvis died, Dr. Nick was not at Graceland. He had been there for much of the summer, traveling in and out as needed. But that particular night, Elvis was home. He was with family and friends. He had a dental appointment that day. He played piano in the early hours of the morning. Someone who was there that night later described it, said Elvis played gospel music until almost dawn, alone at the piano in the dim light of Graceland, singing hymns that his mother had loved. And then he went upstairs, and he never came back down. Dr. George Nikopoulos lived until 2019. He was 88 years old when he died. He spent the last 4 decades of his life carrying something that no verdict could take away from him. The knowledge of what he had seen, year after year, and what he had done, and what he had failed to do. In interviews near the end of his life, the defenses softened. The explanations became quieter. He spoke less about what he had tried to do, and more about what he wished had been different. He said he loved Elvis, and you believe that too, because that's the most painful part of this entire story. Nobody in it was a monster. The doctor loved his patient. The entourage loved their friend. The manager loved his client. The fans loved their idol. Everyone around Elvis Presley, in their own complicated, flawed, insufficient way, loved him. And none of it was enough to save him. Because love without honesty is just a warmer kind of abandonment. Because caring about someone and telling them the hard truth are not the same thing. And the difference between them can be, as it was in this case, the difference between life and death. Elvis Presley was 42 years old. He had a daughter who worshipped him. He had a voice that could reach inside a person's chest and rearrange something fundamental. He had more talent than any one person had a right to possess, and more sadness than any amount of fame could fix, and a doctor who knew the truth and kept it manageable instead of making it loud. The records are still out there, the prescriptions, the dosages, the dates, all of it sitting in the official record, available to anyone who wants to look. But the real document of what happened to Elvis isn't in any medical file. It's in the footage from the last concerts. Watch his eyes in those final performances. Not the voice, not the spectacle, just his eyes. There is something in them that looks like a man standing at the edge of something and knowing it, and choosing to sing one more song anyway. Because it was all he had left. Because the stage was the only place the loneliness went quiet. Because sometimes the truth arrives too late to change anything, and all you can do is stand in the wreckage of it and decide what kind of person you want to be from here. Dr. Nick made his choices. Elvis paid for them. And America is still, nearly 50 years later, trying to make sense of how it let something that beautiful fall apart so quietly. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe for more untold truths behind the legends who shaped America.